Alien and Aliens, 2 for 2 when it came to wowing audiences. And in the years that had followed, the critics who had found fault with the first film recanted. Leonard Maltin revised his low score of the film to 3.5 stars, admitting, quote, "I'm a wimp, and when it first came out, it scared the hell out of me. I found it too upsetting, so I gave it a review that reflected that." Siskel and Ebert gave decidedly mixed reviews. While they ultimately did give it 2 thumbs up, they were of the view that when you got past the art direction and look, it was a very derivative work. It was notable for being scary, but
this is not the greatest science fiction film ever made, even though it seems to be doing very well across the country.
In later years, Ebert would in fact add it to his personal great movies list, and the film he once described as being derivative, he now called one of the great originals. Newspapers gave Alien backhanded compliments like an extremely small, rather decent movie of its modest kind in the New York Times. The Boston Globe described it as another triumph of technology over art, is also a horror movie set in space, and it just doesn't work. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette said Alien has almost no wit, no depth of character, no complexity of plot, no subtext of meaning. In the long run, that might prevent it from becoming a truly classic horror film. And the New Yorker went so far as to say that it was an example of how films are celebrated for their numbers, not their quality, and called it, quote, like an entertainment contrived in Huxley's Brave New World. Yet it wasn't all that long that the critics began to reconsider and reevaluate it, considering it a true classic. Aliens followed a somewhat similar path, though it started out at a much, much higher bar. At the time, it was praised by most critics, and over time, most of the negatives have in fact reversed their views. Both films stand side by side as exceptional science fiction horror flicks. There is thus no surprise in the fact that 20th Century Fox, who had found a replacement for Star Wars and Alien's success, was looking to capitalize on a new sci-fi franchise. With mainstream success, James Cameron went off to develop the first public sign of his deep ocean fascination, with The Abyss, so he wasn't an option for a sequel. Ridley Scott, of course, was a natural choice, and Sigourney Weaver was hopeful they could talk him into it. While she had said she couldn't imagine there being an Alien 3, or that she would be in it if there was one, as established, she'd become friends with Brandywine heads David Giler and Walter Hill, so they asked her if she'd be interested if she became co-producer on the film and had a say in what the film would be. Weaver liked the idea. Unfortunately, Scott wasn't available. In later years, he said he was never asked, but several sources confirmed that he actually was, except he just finished Someone to Watch Over Me, was preparing for Black Rain, and was scheduled to shoot Thelma and Louise. There was no room for Alien 3 in his schedule. For the story, the first person they approached was none other than Clive Barker. This was actually before Hellraiser was released, but Giler thought enough of his work to discuss it. Barker wasn't thrilled with the idea, though. He thought both films were wonderful, but as a creative, he found the creatures to be little more than organic killing machines, and given the constraints that he'd be working under with nothing to really inspire his imagination, he dismissed it. His agent was so outraged that he passed up on such a lucrative opportunity, they parted ways over it. With Barker disinterested, the question was where to find their writer. It turned out he practically fell out of the sky. In September 1987, while on vacation in Thailand, David Giler read a book called Neuromancer. Neuromancer explored a gritty future like Alien had presented, as well as corporate domination, which already put its author, William Gibson, in their wheelhouse. Additionally, it had the less than utopian vision of humanity's relationship with technology, including the fusion of the organic with the machines, which was like the aliens themselves, as Barker had noted. Gibson was intrigued and excited. He'd liked both films immensely. He'd never done a screenplay before, which Brandywine was fine with. Now more seasoned, Gibson believes, and nothing suggests otherwise, that the intention was for him to be the Dan O'Bannon this time, to have all the ideas and then have someone else use them in their own version of the script. As with Cameron, they gave Gibson a story summary, 15 pages about a Cold War in space situation involving the Sulaco drifting into the territory of the Union of Progressive Peoples, Russian and Chinese communists that were mortal enemies of the corporation-empowered nation the colonial marines worked for. The funny thing about Gibson's thoughts on it was that he didn't think of the aliens as biomechanical. He thought of them as biological weapons and wanted to explore them from a genetic and not a hardware view. Still, he set to work, only they laid out the key sticking point. No Ripley. No Ripley? But you can't do an alien film without Ripley. That's crazy. But no, Weaver wanted to keep her part to just a small cameo to draw out her character's arc more. This was partially due to dissatisfaction with Fox expunging everything about Ripley's daughter from Aliens, though that was supported by Cameron, possibly even his idea, that looking back it was too film perfect that she loses a daughter and then finds this little girl in need of a mother. Regardless of the reasons, Gibson was told he had Bishop, Corporal Hicks, and Newt to work with. But that was fine. The world had fallen in love with that little girl, with the Marine with a heart of gold, and the faithful android. They'd be fine with a movie that leaned heavily into those beloved characters. Ripley would be back in Alien 4, they said, as they were planning 3 and 4 to both involve this Cold War plot. That's the reason, if you've ever actually looked at the script, that it ends rather, well, open-ended, because it was intended to leave it open to continue for Alien 4. Gibson thus kept Ripley in stasis, while having Newt sent back to Earth for her safety, and Hicks and Bishop to confront the threats. With the UPP coming aboard the Sulaco, one is the victim of a facehugger and sets in motion the alien threat on Anchor Point Station. Hybrid variants of the aliens exist due to genetic manipulation, and the evil Weyland-Yutani corporate representatives arrive to bring corporate manipulation into the mix. The first draft was more action-oriented, but Gibson pulled it back for the second draft. He submitted it to the Brandywine people and got what he called a Hollywood positive response. That is, true neutral in tone. Truth was, they weren't sure what to do with it. They'd been expecting engaging concepts in a humdrum script. Instead, they got humdrum concepts in an engaging script. That is, none of the really imaginative out there stuff in the spirit of Neuromancer or even Blade Runner that they had wanted. Essentially, they came in wanting to get an H.R. Giger and wound up getting a Bob Ross. Great, but not what they were looking for. At this point, Fox made what could be argued to be a fatal blunder. They were so fixated on the absence of Ripley, they didn't realize that essentially, this was the sequel they wanted. Let me be clear, I'm saying what Gibson gave them is what Fox was looking for this film to be. For them, the Alien films were the tent poles, the big money makers, so that they could produce the more commercially weak prestige cinema that wins awards. Gibson's script had at the very least the solid structure for what they wanted to continue Alien as a profitable science fiction franchise. So with Brandywine unhappy because it lacked mind-blowing sci-fi ideas, and Fox unhappy because it didn't have Ripley in it, Brandywine brought in Rennie Harlin to direct. Harlan had come off the success of A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, which despite being the fourth in a slasher franchise, was the highest grossing until Freddy vs. Jason. So he seemed like a solid bet for the third film. They wanted Harlan to work with Gibson on revising his screenplay, but Gibson declined, citing other commitments, though in truth he was bothered by that lukewarm silence. Gibson's script went on to rank among the great unproduced scripts that people talked about, especially in light of the final result. It would go on to receive both an audio play version, with Lance Henriksen and Michael Biehn reprising their roles, and a comic book, a glimpse into what could have been, instead of Fox's own nightmare, from which there'd be no waking to escape. Rennie Harlin's fear was that no matter what he did, if there were weapons, he'd be unfairly compared to Cameron. Of course, that seemed kind of expected in a Cold War conflict, so that meant starting over. He brought in Eric Red to give a script a try, and set it on a space station styled like a rural American small town, complete with farms and a drive-in theater, and featuring new breeds of xenomorphs loosed on Earth. Red dismissed his own script as utter crap and pulled out. When the script was rejected in its entirety, Harlan walked away, frustrated with the lack of creative direction. David Toohey was now hired to write the script and instructed to build off of Gibson's concepts. However, something no one could have really expected happened. The Berlin Wall came down. Communism was collapsing while the Soviet Union imploded, making the Cold War seem passé. Not to mention that, with the Chinese Communist Party maintaining human rights violating policies while promoting market-driven capitalism, it was starting to look more like the side you'd expect to find Weyland-Yutani on. Tui changed the setting to a prison planet where the convicts were used for experimentation to create new versions of the aliens as biological weapons. Ripley was still out of the script, but Joe Roth, Fox's new studio head, insisted they had to get Weaver to star in the film. She was the only female action star they had, he insisted, apparently not getting that Weaver had no desire to be an action star. Meanwhile, Walter Hill was impressed with The Navigator by New Zealand filmmaker Vincent Ward. They approached him about Alien 3, and he proposed exactly the kind of radical, out-there idea that they'd been hoping for. Ridley's escape pod would crash on a monastic satellite, a cloistered community of technophobic monks living on a man-made wooden planet. The monks would interpret the alien as a manifestation of the devil punishing them for their sins. The presence of Ripley, the sole woman to enter their all-male sanctuary, would ignite fears of temptation and heresy among the monks. Ripley herself would discover she's carrying an alien embryo, a result of a facehugger stowaway, and ultimately sacrifices herself to destroy the creature, a martyrdom completing her arc. This was an idea Weaver liked, and Ward was brought on to direct, while John Fasano was hired to adapt it to a screenplay. However, the shine started to come off the apple very quickly. How, practically, would you have a wooden planet like the one talked about? The Brandywine guys wondered. Fox found it too artsy-fartsy, unhappy that it wasn't something with more action in it. Disillusioned with how his ideas were being compromised, Ward left, just months before filming was to start, while sets were being built at Pinewood. Fox and Weaver went to Hill and Giler and said they really needed to put on their writer's caps and fix the script while they had time. They were under the gun, though not literally, because it turns out Fox's only female action star wouldn't do the movie if there were guns in it. Well, like usually happens when you're tired, overworked, and under enormous pressure, when faced with fixing Tui's prison script or Fasano's monk script, they decided to just combine the two and make them convict monks. They made the prison monastery a mining colony to maintain continuity with the overall dirty machinery alien aesthetic. To punch up the dialogue, they hired Larry Ferguson, who wrote Beverly Hills Cop 2 and helped adapt The Hunt for Red October. He was promptly fired. As Weaver said, he made Ripley sound like a pissed-off gym teacher. So unhappy with that, in fact, that Weaver put in her contract that the final script had to be written by Hill and Giler to make sure it would fit Ripley's character. But they wouldn't be able to direct. They'd need to find someone else to do that job. With only 5 weeks left before shooting, the final director they approached was David Fincher. The list of his triumphs is astonishing. Seven, Fight Club, Zodiac, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Gone Girl, The Social Network, and more. Critical hits and box office successes. He was an absolutely phenomenal choice if you wanted to make Alien 3 a hit, with only one strike against him. None of that had happened yet. They had Ridley Scott for the first, James Cameron for the second, David Fincher for the third, a track record of directors who would go on to massive success and acclaim, but Fincher wasn't given the chance to prepare to do this right. He was coming in from music videos at the time. Yes, Scott and Cameron both came in with time pressure, but not this much time pressure. And they came in with much more clout. Ridley Scott owned RSA. He had experience with running a studio and handling a crew. James Cameron was an experienced guerrilla filmmaker who'd put out a major success. They both came in with more than just talent, but the capacity to say, "I've been where you are, so shut up and do what I say." That's what you'd need, coming in with barely a month's prep to get things going, and even then, both those guys probably would have refused this job. Fincher no doubt saw it as his lucky break. Instead, he'd been thrown to the xenomorphs. Fincher tried all he could. He brought in Rex Pickett to revise the third act, but Hillengiler resisted, and after angry words were exchanged, Pickett was fired. The script wasn't even nailed down, but there was enough to at least start, which Fox was fine with. And Weaver had confidence in the Brandywine team. Only Fincher was saying they needed more time. For a film like this, they really needed to get the script in order and be sure of what they were doing. No chance. He started rolling, or he was going to get rolled out the door. Fox had advertised it for late 1991, and they were determined to hit that release date. To show the Omnishambles on display, they then released a teaser trailer with a 1992 release date, and stating it would be set on Earth, the long-abandoned idea from when Eric Red and Rennie Harlan had been on the project. Fincher had ideas, certainly. He said to Weaver after one meeting, "What if we shaved your head?" She loved the idea. Using lice as an excuse, everyone inside would be hairless, a way to look distinct. The decision had been made that all the prisoners were double Y chromosomes. That is, they had a second Y chromosome, which people used to think made some people more aggressive and violent. That's a myth. But they wanted the idea to be that these monks were savages underneath, and the idea that man is the real monster. But who would these men be? To play the role of Dylan, the spiritual leader of the convicts, was Charles S. Dutton. Dutton brought intense gravitas to the role of inmate preacher who tries to keep the peace. What was particularly remarkable was that Dutton himself was a real-life former convict who turned his life around through theater. This gave his performance authenticity as a hardened yet principled prisoner. Dutton mentioned that he was drawn to the role's combination of toughness and moral complexity, and Fincher praised his presence, saying he embodied the ecclesial, the preacher-like, quality that was needed for Dylan. Importantly, Dutton's casting helped anchor the film's ensemble with a commanding American actor to complement Weaver, because they'd be needing to bring in a lot of British actors under the circumstances. Fincher was a big fan of the film Withnail and I, and given that they'd need Brits, he hoped that he could get Richard E. Grant, Paul McGann, and Ralph Brown here as a sort of reunion. McGann would play the deranged Golic, Brown would play 85, the non-prisoner assistant to the prison overseer, and Grant as Dr. Clemens, the world-weary prison doctor who would become Ripley's confidant. But there was concern from above that Grant wasn't a good choice, either for salary or just not a good fit. There's disagreement. While Grant himself says that he refused the part ultimately over concerns with it being a sequel, and the violence, and the fact he'd need to shave his head. Instead, the role went to Charles Dance, the great character actor who normally got authoritative or villainous roles, but now was playing the friendly ally. Despite not being Fincher's first pick, Dance had tremendous respect for the 27-year-old director. Quote, "Here's this guy, young enough to be my son, who knew all the crew's jobs and all the shots he wanted. I thought, my God, this guy is going to go far." The most controversial wasn't those being chosen, but those who weren't. Specifically, the characters of Corporal Hicks and Newt. For the body of Hicks, they were going to use a cast of Richard Bean's face left over from the Terminator that someone had managed to acquire. Dino De Laurentiis' daughter, who was working with Michael Biehn at the time, tipped him off to this unauthorized use of his likeness. Biehn was already upset that he went from starting this film as the co-star anchor of a franchise to the guy who dies off screen. Well, after that little stunt, he charged them a lot for the use of his likeness in a photograph, almost as much as his salary for the last film. And he insisted that the plan to have him killed off-screen by a chestburster be nixed. Newt, played by a different actress, as by now Hen was no longer acting and was too old to play 10 anyway, was seen drowned and then her body half naked before an autopsy. Bishop would be brought online long enough to help the plot and then be put down for good. An appropriate reversal for a film that began with Soviet Russia, the one person who didn't want to come back was the star, and the 3 slated to star were killed off. This would make a bad situation worse. As stated, Aliens had become a critical and commercial success, and the audience cheered all 3 characters. Killing them off, like this, was a very brave choice. But bravery that fails is just foolishness. Fincher's job was like a man trying to play billiards on the deck of a ship in a roiling sea. Everything was in constant motion and there was no idea where things were going to go. The script was being rewritten while he was shooting it, and not with his input either. Things he did want to do fell apart. He hired Giger to come back and design a more animalistic quadrupedal creature called the Bambi Burster, but in the end, the alien walked upright anyway. It quickly became apparent that he may be directing the picture, but he wasn't the director. He was a hired hand they expected to do what he was told. Studio execs were sent out to troubleshoot, which really just meant micromanaging him. But Fox was panicking. They were bleeding money on their ill-considered sequel. Fincher was being second-guessed while in the middle of the job. Perhaps most insulting was a look at a rough assembly. Rather than inspiring confidence, instead prompted them to shut down the production. Everyone was pulled back to Los Angeles, and Hill and Giler, at Fox's behest, took over control of post-production. They were no longer shooting a film as far as the studio was concerned, they were salvaging a film. A list of reshoots and changes was made to make the film commercially viable, with virtually no input from Fincher anymore. Things had dragged on so long that Weaver had to reshave her head twice. It reached the point where she drew the line and said she wasn't doing it again. They just were going to have to shoot around it. It wasn't the only thing that she put her foot down on. Weaver took the role because Ripley was going to die. She put it in her contract. Fox had to do it. The problem was, the film was bleak. Ripley is nearly violated by some convicts. The deaths come with almost slasher film-like timing. Dance's character dies the moment he finishes his backstory. And oh yes, they killed everyone else off. Nihilistic was a word being thrown around a lot. And then they were going to kill, as we've established, Fox's only female action star. And what's worse, they had been beaten to their ending by James Cameron, no less. In the time that all these suits spent puttering around on trying to come up with a sequel, Cameron had gone off to make The Abyss, finished it, and then went off to make a sequel to The Terminator, finished it, and it was now in theaters. And they weren't done shooting Alien 3 yet. And what's worse, it ended with Schwarzenegger's reformed killing machine turned protector asking to be destroyed to protect his charge and the human race by being lowered into a pool of glowing orange metal while giving a thumbs up. A bittersweet end that left audiences with moistened eyes, but cheering. Ripley was going to die practically the same way, after half an hour of begging to be put out of her misery, less bittersweet than just bitter. They were stuck with how to rescue the film, but it seemed just as doomed as Ripley herself. By that point, Fincher was effectively out of the loop. This was not the sequel that Fox wanted, but it was the sequel that mismanagement brought them. A film audiences found started bleak and managed to get worse. The critical savaging would not be recanted as with Alien and Aliens. It was, like a victim of its title character, just savaged. Cameron himself spoke out against the film for the disservice that it did to people who had come to care about Hicks, Bishop, and Newt. He recognized where blame lay for that, though, and said that Fox left Fincher with, quote, a big mess on a plate. That mess was a disconnect by every level of what everyone wanted. Fox wanted a nice, safe picture to be another hit like the last two had been. Brandywine wanted to avoid anything resembling repetition. Fincher and Weaver wanted to create an art picture. Well, congratulations. Nobody got what they wanted. And least of all, the audience. And it seemed that Alien 3 would go down in history as the dud. Not a flop, but it was a hunchback in the company of giants, with little chance that would ever get the chance to stand tall. Fincher was so burned by the experience that he has utterly abandoned Alien 3. No one hates this film more than me, he insisted. No promotional work, no DVD commentaries. He has washed his hands of the film and the franchise. Some speculate that, ironically, this may have contributed to his ultimate success. Having been so horribly publicly burned by lack of control, Fincher ensures that he is not getting pushed around ever again. As established, his career speaks for itself. This did, however, lead to an unusual problem more than a decade later. In the early 2000s, The Lord of the Rings by Peter Jackson was released in theaters with long run times to cover the massive tales. But on home media, the audience discovered they were even longer. These extended cuts showed the market out there for enhanced editions of hit films. Fox had in fact done that with Aliens in 1991, in anticipation of Alien 3. James Cameron came in and created a director's cut of that film, restoring scenes like the sentry guns that showed the relentlessness of the aliens. Fox wanted to do a massive prestige release of all 4 Alien films that existed at that time. It was going to have all the bells and whistles, all those little extras, and director's cuts for all 4 movies this time. Ridley Scott liked that idea, having the film more fully reflect the intended vision, and among other changes, reworked the egg morphing scene to be kinetic enough to fit in with its timing in the film. Jean-Pierre Jeunet, director of the 4th film, came back, though he didn't really consider a director's cut because his preferred cut was the one released in theaters. But he added certain pieces back in that he thought might enhance it. However, when it came to Alien 3, Fincher had no interest at all in doing a director's cut. When Charles de Lauzirika, who produced all these behind-the-scenes specials and vignettes, reached out, Fincher wouldn't even answer the phone. He did leave one voicemail, saying that even saying the name Alien 3 was just too painful for him. Okay, except Fox wanted the Alien Quadrilogy, as the collected set would be called, to boast that it had enhanced versions of all the films, not all of the films except the one they screwed up. Alien 3 was generally considered the booby prize of the bunch already. There was no need to say the quiet part loud by not giving it an extended cut. But Fincher was not interested in reliving the worst days of his professional life. With no options left, Lauzirika was forced to create a director's cut without a director. Using all of the information they could find to try to determine what Fincher's intent had been for the film, they pulled all the footage that there was. This was an entirely different kind of animal here. Alien and Aliens were masterpieces in their own right. The director's cut just added some enhancements, some scenes excised not for quality, but for runtime. Alien 3 wasn't a masterpiece. Let's be honest about that. Its own mother didn't love it. They took full liberties with the revision this time, moving and changing things, adding things, cutting things. Most controversially, they removed the dog and went with an ox as far as what was impregnated by the facehugger. It's the one point mentioned as being a change for the worse. There were incomplete effects that had been shot with puppeteers that were supposed to be rotoscoped out, but wasn't done because the footage was cut. The effects were instead redone with CGI. Lauzirika was in contact with editor Terry Rawlings and special effects head Richard Edlund to ensure that those kinds of changes matched with their intentions from the time. 37 minutes were added, 7 minutes were removed, and the result was called the Assembly Cut. This new version was so much better received that when it was included in the Blu-ray version, they hired Weaver, Henriksen, and Dance to do ADR to fix the dialogue that had been hard to understand. In what is perhaps the most bizarre sort of vindication possible, Alien 3 has a singular achievement among all the films, great and small, in the entire franchise. It is the only one with a place within the Smithsonian. A prop egg that had been presumed to be from the original Alien was added to the Smithsonian's Entertainment Nation section, alongside the amber cane from Jurassic Park, the ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, Stallone's boxing robe from Rocky, and the costumes of R2-D2 and C-3PO in Return of the Jedi. It was later discovered that the egg was, in fact, the one from that absurd teaser trailer for Alien 3, the one claiming it was going to happen on Earth. Yes, that egg. Despite the misidentification, the egg remains. the only piece of alien history in the Smithsonian. Alien 3 may be regarded as unfit to share the same shelf with the first two films, but in America's prestige museum, it stands alone.